The morning sun cast long shadows across the wheat fields as old John Miller walked along the edge of his farm, his weathered boots leaving prints in the soft soil. The golden stalks swayed gently in the breeze, a sight that never failed to bring a slight smile to his sun-wrinkled face. At 68, he moved with the steady purpose of someone who had spent decades working the land. His daily routine was simple but meaningful. Up before dawn, coffee on the porch while watching the sunrise, then out to check the crops. The neighbors knew him as the quiet farmer who lived alone in the old white farmhouse at the end of County Road 23. They'd wave as they drove past, and he'd raise his hand in return, but few ever stopped to chat. Life on the Kansas farm suited John just fine. The peaceful surroundings were a world away from his previous life, though sometimes, when military planes flew overhead during training exercises from the nearby base, his eyes would follow them with a knowing look. Those moments would transport him back, but he'd quickly return to the task at hand, whether it was fixing a fence or checking the irrigation systems. This particular morning, he was inspecting some new wheat sprouts when his old farm dog, Buddy, perked up his ears. The dog had been with him for 12 years, a loyal companion who understood the rhythm of farm life as well as his master did. John patted the dog's head, knowing that Buddy's senses were still sharp despite his age. In his tool shed, John kept everything meticulously organized, a habit that had stayed with him from his military days. Rows of wrenches hung in size order, and every tool had its designated spot. The local farming community respected him for his orderly ways and willingness to lend a hand during harvest season, even if they didn't know much about his past. The only hints of his previous life were tucked away in the farmhouse attic, medals, photographs, and commendations gathering dust in old boxes. He rarely went up there, preferring to focus on the present. The farm had become his sanctuary, a place where he could find peace in the simple rhythms of planting and harvesting. That afternoon, as John worked on repairing his old tractor, a few locals stopped by to ask about borrowing some equipment. He listened patiently to their request, wiping his hands on an old rag as they spoke. His calm, measured way of talking put people at ease, though there was something in his bearing that commanded natural respect. He agreed to lend them what they needed, just as he always did. As the day drew to a close, John sat on his porch with a cup of tea, Buddy lying at his feet. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, and a cool breeze rustled through the wheat fields. He thought of the next day's work. The irrigation system needed checking, and the north field fence had a loose post that needed fixing. Little did he know that his peaceful farming life was about to be disrupted. The distant rumble of motorcycles echoed from the highway, a sound that would soon become all too familiar. But for now, on this quiet evening, John Miller was simply a farmer watching the sun set over his fields, content in the life he built for himself after hanging up his uniform. The first time the motorcycles roared past John's farm, he didn't think much of it. But by the third day, when the group of riders deliberately veered off the main road and onto his property, he knew something was different. Their bikes kicked up dust clouds as they circled through his newly planted wheat field, leaving ugly tire tracks carved into the soft earth. From his spot near the barn, John watched as the gang of 8 riders laughed and shouted, treating his farmland like their personal playground. Their leather jackets gleamed in the afternoon sun, decorated with patches that marked them as members of the Road Raiders, a group that had been making trouble in nearby towns over the past few months. Buddy, usually calm around visitors, stood alert beside John, his ears pulled back as the bike's engines revved louder. The gang's leader, a tall man with a thick beard who went by Razor, seemed to take particular joy in driving his heavy bike through the irrigation ditches John had spent weeks maintaining. "Hey, old-timer!" Razor shouted over the rumble of engines, pulling his bike to a stop and removing his sunglasses. "Nice place you got here. Great for our riding practice." The other riders circled slowly behind him, their engines idling like growling beasts. Some of them were filming the whole thing on their phones, probably for their social media accounts. John's neighbors had warned him about this group. They'd been causing problems at other farms in the county. Nothing serious enough to get the police too involved, but enough to make people nervous. They seemed to target older farmers, thinking they'd be easy to intimidate. The next day, they came back. This time, they brought more riders with them. They rode through John's tomato garden, crushing plants he'd been growing for the local food bank. Some of them grabbed apples from his small orchard, taking bites and throwing the rest at his mailbox. All the while, they kept their phones out, recording their fun. One younger rider, wearing a brand new leather jacket that still looked stiff, knocked over several beehives John kept at the edge of his property. The sight of his beloved bees scattered and distressed made something shift in John's expression, though he remained still, watching from his porch. Later that evening, as John cleaned up the mess they'd left behind, his closest neighbor, Tom, drove up in his pickup truck. "I saw what happened, John. Maybe we should call the sheriff?" Tom suggested, helping to right one of the fallen beehives. But John just shook his head slowly, his mind already working on a different solution. The gang's visits became more frequent over the next week. They'd show up at random times, always making sure to damage something new. They knocked down sections of fence, scattered feed meant for John's chickens, and kept driving through his crops. Each time, they seemed disappointed that the quiet old farmer didn't react to their provocations. What they didn't notice was how John observed their patterns, when they arrived, which routes they took, how they organized themselves. His eyes tracked their movements with the practiced attention of someone who had spent years studying and anticipating threats. While they saw an old farmer too timid to confront them, John was actually gathering information, biding his time. As the sun set that Friday evening, John heard the now familiar rumble of motorcycles approaching. But this time, instead of just watching, he stepped off his porch and walked slowly toward his driveway. Buddy followed close behind, tail low, but steady. The time for quiet observation was over. On a hot afternoon, John decided it was time to have a word with the bikers. He'd spent enough time watching them damage his property, and his patience, though considerable, had its limits. As their bikes roared onto his land once again, he walked calmly down his driveway, his steps measured and deliberate. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard with unexpected authority. "I'd like a word with you about the damage you've been causing." The gang members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by this direct approach from the farmer they'd been harassing. Razor cut his engine and dismounted, standing a head taller than John. His leather vest was decorated with patches claiming territory and showing off his gang status. "Well, look who finally found his voice," he sneered, while his gang members gathered behind him, some still sitting on their idling bikes. "I've been patient," John continued, keeping his tone level. "But you've destroyed crops that could have fed hundreds of families. Those beehives you knocked over, they were part of a local pollination program helping other farms in the area." He gestured to the damaged fields around them. "This isn't just about me." The gang members laughed, but there was something about John's calm demeanor that made a few of them shift uncomfortably. One of the younger riders even killed his engine, as if to hear better. John stood his ground, hands relaxed at his sides, feet planted firmly in the soil he'd worked for years. "Listen, old man," Razor stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate. "Maybe you don't understand how things work around here now. This is our practice ground. Unless," he paused, a cruel smile spreading across his face, "you want to make a financial arrangement. A small weekly payment could guarantee your farm's safety." Behind them, more bikes arrived. Reinforcements Razor had called in to make his point clearer. The rumble of engines filled the air as they surrounded John in a loose circle. Dust kicked up from their wheels, but John didn't flinch. Instead, something changed in his stance, subtle but noticeable. His shoulders squared almost imperceptibly. His feet shifted slightly, finding solid ground. Most notably his eyes, which had been calm and patient, took on a hardness that made even Razor pause mid-sentence. It wasn't fear in the old farmer's eyes, but something else entirely. Something that spoke of experience with situations far more dangerous than this. "I've seen your social media posts," John said quietly, yet somehow his voice carried over the engine noise. "Bragging about harassing local farmers, filming yourselves destroying private property. The police might be interested in those videos." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But I'd rather handle this civilly." Razor's face reddened with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he saw as an easy target. "Are you threatening me, old-timer?" he growled, stepping even closer. His gang members revved their engines, creating an intimidating wall of noise. But John's expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed calmer now, like someone who had found familiar ground. His next words came out clear and measured. "No, sir. I'm giving you a choice. You can either leave my property now and never return, or we can explore other options. And trust me," he added, his voice taking on a tone that made several gang members straighten up involuntarily, "you won't enjoy the other options." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Even Buddy, who had been watching from the porch, sensed the shift in atmosphere and trotted over to stand beside his master, hackles slightly raised. The standoff had reached its tipping point, and what happened next would change everything. The evening sun cast long shadows across the farm as Razor and his gang decided to make their final move. They'd spent the afternoon plotting after John's confrontation had wounded their pride. Now, as dusk approached, they returned in full force, their bikes' headlights cutting through the growing darkness. John was in his barn, storing tools after a day's work, when he heard them approach. This time was different. The engines weren't revving for show. They moved with purpose, surrounding the barn in a tight formation. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, John could see them carrying gas cans and chains. "Come on out, farmer." Razor's voice boomed across the yard. "Time to teach you about respect." The gang had positioned themselves strategically, or at least what they thought was strategic, around the barn. Some held heavy chains, others had baseball bats. They'd clearly decided that intimidation wasn't enough anymore. Inside the barn, John took a deep breath. His hands were steady as he put down his wrench and wiped them clean with an old rag. Buddy growled softly beside him, but John patted the dog's head, calming him. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "We've handled worse." "You've got 1 minute to come out," Razor shouted, "or we start with this barn. After that, maybe we'll see how fireproof that nice house of yours is." The other gang members laughed, the sound echoing across the previously peaceful farm. They started pouring gasoline around the barn's perimeter, the strong smell filling the air. John stepped out of the barn slowly, deliberately. The security lights he'd installed after their earlier visits illuminated the scene like a stage. His eyes took in every detail: 12 bikes, 15 men, various makeshift weapons. But more importantly, he noticed their sloppy positioning, their overconfidence, their complete lack of real tactical awareness. "Last chance, old man," Razor said, holding up a lighter. "Either you start paying us protection money, or we burn everything you own to the ground. And don't think about calling the cops. We've got friends watching the roads." He flicked the lighter on and off, trying to look menacing. The evening breeze rustled through the wheat fields, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. John's posture changed, not dramatically, but noticeably. Gone was the humble farmer's slight stoop. His back straightened, shoulders squared, chin lifted. He moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had commanded respect in far worse situations. "You boys made 3 mistakes," John said, his voice carrying across the yard with parade ground authority. "First, you assumed I was helpless because I chose to be peaceful. Second, you threatened to destroy not just my property, but my home." He paused, looking each gang member in the eye. "And third, You surrounded yourselves with fuel while holding an open flame. Something in his voice made several gang members take involuntary steps backward. Even Razor's hand wavered, the lighter's flame flickering. There was steel in the old farmer's voice now, the kind that comes from years of giving orders that meant the difference between life and death. "I've spent the last few weeks watching you," John continued, starting to walk forward with measured steps, "recording your license plates, documenting the damage, noting faces, and I've been making calls, not to the local police, but to some old friends who specialize in handling situations like this." The change in the atmosphere was palpable. The gang's earlier bravado began to crack as John moved among them with the confidence of someone who had faced down far worse threats. A few of the younger members were already backing toward their bikes, the reality of their situation starting to dawn on them. Then John did something unexpected. He smiled. But it wasn't the smile of a kindly farmer. It was the smile of someone who had spent decades leading men into battle, who had faced down real dangers, and who knew exactly how this confrontation was going to end. The security lights caught the glint of something metallic on John's chest as he reached up and unbuttoned his work shirt. Underneath was a simple white t-shirt, but what caught everyone's attention was the military dog tags that had been hidden beneath his collar. They clinked softly in the evening breeze. "Since we're having this conversation," John said, his voice taking on a tone of command that seemed to fill the entire yard, "let me properly introduce myself. Lieutenant Colonel John Miller, former commander of the 66th Armored Regiment. 28 years of active service, 3 tours leading tank divisions in combat zones." A young gang member at the back suddenly dropped his chain, the metal clattering loudly on the ground. "Wait, Iron Jack Miller," he stammered, his face going pale. "The Iron Jack Miller." The nickname seemed to echo across the farmyard, carrying with it a weight that made several other gang members exchange nervous glances. "The same," John replied simply, "though I haven't heard that name in a while." He walked over to a nearby tractor, casually leaning against it as if this was just another evening chat. "You know, leading a tank division isn't just about firepower. It's about strategy, about reading your opponent, about knowing when they've put themselves in a bad position." The younger gang member was now frantically whispering to his companions, sharing stories he'd heard about Iron Jack Miller, the commander who had led one of the most successful tank divisions in modern military history. The man who had saved an entire town with just 3 tanks against overwhelming odds. The strategist who had never lost a single member of his crew in all his years of service. Razor tried to maintain his tough appearance, but his hand holding the lighter was visibly shaking now. "You expect us to believe that? You're just some old farmer." But the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Check your phone," John suggested calmly. "Look up the 66th Armored Regiment. I'm sure you all have internet access, given how fond you are of posting your exploits online." Several gang members immediately pulled out their phones, their faces illuminated by the screens as they searched. "Oh man," one of them muttered, holding up his phone to show the others. "It's him. Look at these old photos." They crowded around the screen, comparing the decorated officer and the military photos to the farmer standing before them. The resemblance was unmistakable, just as was the air of authority that now radiated from him. "My last command," John continued, walking slowly around the group, "was training young soldiers in advanced tactical operations, teaching them how to handle themselves in difficult situations." He paused, looking pointedly at the gas cans they'd brought. "Teaching them about things like proper perimeter security, tactical positioning, and why you never, ever surround yourself with flammable materials." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the crickets seemed to have stopped chirping. The gang members who had been so bold just minutes ago now looked like schoolboys caught in a serious misdeed. Their tough facade had crumbled in the face of a real warrior. "I've spent the last few weeks documenting everything," John added, his voice matter of fact. "Every act of vandalism, every threat, every social media post. I've got enough evidence to put several of you away for a long time. But more importantly, he smiled slightly, I've got a lot of friends who would be very interested in paying this farm a visit. Former tank commanders tend to stick together, you see. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard. Heavy vehicles, by the sound of it. John checked his watch. And if I'm not mistaken, some of them are about to arrive for our weekly veterans coffee meeting. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say? The young gang member who had first recognized John's name couldn't contain himself anymore. His hands trembled as he pulled up more information on his phone. Guys, you don't understand, he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and awe. This man, he's a legend. The Battle of Thunder Valley, that was him. Other gang members crowded around the phone, their tough guy facades crumbling as they scrolled through article after article. Photos showed a younger John Miller standing proudly beside massive tanks, receiving medals, leading troops. One particular image showed him pulling wounded soldiers to safety while under heavy fire. The Thunder Valley operation, John said quietly, was supposed to be a simple defense mission. We were outnumbered 4-1, low on supplies, and had to protect a town of civilians. He walked over to his tractor, running his hand along its side. You know, driving a tractor isn't so different from driving a tank. Both require patience, skill, and understanding of the terrain. Razor, trying desperately to maintain some control over the situation, scoffed. So what? That was years ago. You're just an old man now. But his words lacked conviction, and several of his gang members had already started backing away toward their bikes. The young gang member spoke up again, his earlier bravado completely gone. He led the largest tank division in modern combat history. 0 casualties under his command. They called him Iron Jack because he was like an iron shield for his men. Nothing got past him. No one under his command ever died. More phones came out as the gang members searched for information. The security lights illuminated their faces, showing expressions of growing respect and fear as they read about their elderly farmer's true identity. Pictures of military ceremonies, news articles about successful missions, and stories of his legendary tactical skills filled their screens. Here's something interesting, John continued, his voice carrying across the now quiet farmyard. In tank warfare, one of the first things you learn is how to spot when you're in a tactically disadvantageous position. He gestured to the way they had arranged themselves. For instance, you've positioned yourselves with no clear escape route, surrounded by evidence of your own crimes. And he smiled slightly. You can probably hear those vehicles getting closer. Indeed, the rumble of approaching heavy vehicles was getting louder. The sound was distinctly different from their motorcycles, deeper, more powerful, more purposeful. Several gang members were now openly moving toward their bikes, all thoughts of intimidation forgotten. The young gang member suddenly straightened up, as if remembering something important. The monthly veterans meeting, he whispered, loud enough for others to hear. They talk about it at the diner in town. Every month, former tank commanders from 3 states gather at a local farm too. His voice trailed off as the realization hit him. To share stories, drink coffee, and keep our skills sharp, John finished for him. And you know what's funny? Today's topic was going to be about handling hostile forces in civilian territories. He checked his watch again. In fact, they should be pulling up right about. The sound of multiple heavy-duty trucks and jeeps turning onto his long driveway finished his sentence for him. Headlights began to appear in the distance, cutting through the evening darkness. The vehicles moved with military precision, spreading out as they approached the farm. Razor's lighter, which had been his tool intimidation just minutes earlier, slipped from his fingers and fell to the ground. The small flame extinguished itself in the dirt, much like his gang's bravado had extinguished in the face of who they'd really been harassing. The rumble of approaching vehicles grew louder as John calmly walked to his front gate. The gang members stood frozen, watching as 5 massive pickup trucks, and 3 military-style jeeps pulled into the farm's entrance. Each vehicle was spotlessly maintained, carrying men who, despite their age, moved with military precision as they stepped out. "Evening, Colonel," called out a tall man from the first truck, his voice carrying the same commanding tone as John's. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, but his bearing screamed military. "We thought we'd come early for coffee. Hope you don't mind the unexpected company." "Perfect timing as always, Bill," John replied with a slight smile. "Our young friends here were just learning about tactical positioning and threat assessment." He gestured toward the gang members, who were now huddled together near their bikes, looking significantly less threatening than they had just minutes ago. The veterans spread out naturally, taking positions around the farmyard without any obvious communication, decades of training showing in their movements. Many of them wore casual clothes, but their eyes scanned the scene with professional attention to detail. "You know," John said, turning back to Razor and his gang, "I could have called the police weeks ago. Could have pressed charges for trespassing, vandalism, attempted arson." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I believe in teaching moments. Right now, you have a choice to make." One of the veterans, a weathered-looking man with gray hair, spoke up. "Those are some nice bikes you boys have there. Would be ashamed if they got impounded as evidence. The paperwork on those things can take months to process." His tone was conversational, but the threat was clear. Razor, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, cleared his throat. "Look, we didn't know. We thought." He struggled to find words that wouldn't make the situation worse. "Here's what's going to happen," John said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "You're going to leave my farm and never come back. You're going to stop harassing other farmers in the county. And you're going to spend next weekend helping repair all the damage you've caused. Under supervision, of course." The young gang member who had first recognized John stepped forward. "Sir, I've read about what you did in Thunder Valley. How you saved those people. I never thought." He swallowed hard. "We'll fix everything, I promise." Another veteran chuckled. "Remember when we were young hotheads too, John? Before the service straightened us out?" Several other veterans nodded, small smiles playing on their weathered faces. "That's why I'm offering you this chance," John said. "Everyone deserves an opportunity to make better choices." He pulled out a notebook from his pocket. "I have your license plate numbers, names from your social media posts, and enough evidence to make life very difficult for all of you. Or," he paused meaningfully, "you can choose to learn from this." The sound of bikes starting up filled the air as gang members began mounting their motorcycles, all thoughts of intimidation forgotten. Razor, looking both embarrassed and relieved, nodded quickly. "We'll be here Saturday morning to fix everything. You have my word." "Good choice," John said simply. "And spread the word to your other friends. This farm and every other farm in this county is off limits." He gestured toward the veterans around him. "We might be retired, but we still know how to handle troubles." As the bikes roared away into the night, one of the veterans walked up to John, shaking his head with a smile. "You always did prefer teaching lessons to fighting battles, Colonel." He looked at the retreating bikes. "Think they learned this one." John watched the dust settle on his driveway. Time will tell. "Now, who's ready for some coffee? I believe we have some tactical scenarios to discuss." True to their word, the gang members showed up early Saturday morning. The rumble of their motorcycles was different now, subdued, respectful. They parked in a neat line along the driveway, a far cry from their previous chaotic entrances. Razor led the group, carrying tools and wearing work clothes instead of their usual leather jackets. John stood on his porch, sipping his morning coffee as they arrived. 3 of his veteran friends had also come by, casually positioned around the farm, keeping a watchful eye on the proceedings. The morning sun cast long shadows across the fields as the work began. "First thing," John said, walking over to the group, "those irrigation ditches need fixing. The crops won't water themselves. He spoke with the same commanding presence he'd used leading troops, but there was something else in his voice now, a teacher's patience. The young gang member who had recognized John's military history worked particularly hard, asking questions about the farm and, occasionally, about John's service. "Sir," he said during a water break, wiping sweat from his forehead, "my grandfather was in the military too. He used to tell me stories, but I never listened. I wish I had now." Throughout the day, something unexpected happened. As the gang members worked to repair fences, rebuild the beehives, and replant damaged crops, their attitudes began to shift. They started taking pride in their work, asking questions about farming, and even sharing stories of their own lives. "You know," John said as he showed them how to properly set fence posts, "farming isn't so different from military service. It requires discipline, attention to detail, and respect for the land you're defending." He demonstrated the correct technique, his hands steady and sure. Every choice you make affects not just you, but the whole community. By mid-afternoon, the transformation was remarkable. The same men who had threatened to burn down his barn were now carefully repairing it, following John's instructions with surprising enthusiasm. Even Razor, who had tried to maintain his tough image, was fully engaged in rebuilding the chicken coop. One of the veterans watching the work smiled and whispered to John, "You're still leading troops, Colonel. Just in a different way now." John nodded, understanding the truth in those words. He'd always believed in the power of second chances. Local farmers drove by throughout the day, slowing down to watch the unusual sight. Word had spread quickly about what had happened, and many stopped to witness the former troublemakers working alongside the respected farmer. Some even brought food and drinks, turning the day of restitution into something approaching a community event. As the sun began to set, the work was nearly complete. The farm looked better than it had in weeks. The gang members gathered their tools, tired but carrying themselves differently now. There was a sense of accomplishment in their faces that hadn't been there before. "Sir," Razor said, approaching John with newfound respect, "we've been thinking. Some of the other farms in the county probably need help too. Would it be okay if we maybe came back sometimes to help out?" The request was genuine, his earlier arrogance replaced by something closer to humility. John studied the group for a moment, seeing beyond their tough exteriors to the potential underneath. "Every Thursday," he said finally. "We'll work on different farms each week. But," he added with a slight smile, "you'll have to learn things properly. No shortcuts." The sound of motorcycles leaving the farm that evening was different from all the times before. They rode in an orderly line, respecting the speed limit, their usual roaring engines quieted to a respectful purr. As they disappeared down the road, one of John's veteran friends chuckled. "Only you, Iron Jack," he said, "could turn a gang of troublemakers into volunteer farmhands in one day." John just smiled, watching the sun set over his peaceful fields. Sometimes, the greatest victories, he knew, were won without a single shot being fired. Word spread quickly through the farming community about the remarkable transformation that had taken place on John Miller's farm. The story grew richer with each telling. How a quiet farmer had turned a threatening situation into something positive, without a single punch thrown or law enforcement called. 1 month after the confrontation, John's farm had become a gathering place every Thursday afternoon. The former gang members arrived regularly, their bikes now welcome sounds in the community. They worked alongside local farmers, learning about agriculture, sharing stories, and slowly earning the trust of those they had once terrorized. The young bike enthusiast who had first recognized John had become a regular visitor even outside the Thursday meetings. He helped John with daily chores, soaking up stories about both farming and military service. "My grandfather would have loved this," he often said, carefully tending to the rebuilt beehives. "He always told me I needed direction in my life." Guess he was right. One sunny afternoon, as John watched Razor and his group helping a neighboring farm repair their old barn, his veteran friends stopped by for their usual coffee meeting. You know what the locals are calling your Thursday crew now? One of them asked with a grin. The Farm Force. They say you've built yourself a new kind of tank division. The nickname stuck, though not in the way anyone expected. The former gang members embraced it, proudly helping farms across 3 counties. Their leather jackets, once decorated with intimidating patches, now bore a simple emblem of a tractor and wheat stalks, their own design to show their new purpose. During harvest season, the impact of John's unusual solution became clear. Farms that had once struggled with labor shortages now had eager helpers. The bikers' mechanical skills, previously used to modify motorcycles, proved invaluable in repairing farming equipment. They worked with the same passion they had once put into causing trouble, but now for a better purpose. John's farm became more than just a meeting place. It turned into an unofficial community center. Young people who might have been drawn to trouble found purpose instead. Local veterans shared their experiences, not just of war, but of finding meaning in civilian life. The porch where John had once sat alone became a place where wisdom was passed down and friendships were forged. "You've done more than save your farm," one of his veteran friends commented during a quiet evening gathering. "You've shown these young folks what real strength looks like." They watched as former troublemakers taught newcomers about proper irrigation techniques and crop rotation, their pride evident in every explanation. The local diner, which had once been wary of leather-clad bikers, now had a special Thursday evening menu for what they called the Farm Force Feast. The sight of motorcycles and farming trucks parked side by side became common, a symbol of how things had changed. As autumn approached, John stood in his fields one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Buddy, his faithful dog, sat beside him as always. The farm was quiet now, but he could still hear echoes of the day's activity, the sound of laughter, the rumble of bikes leaving for home, the satisfaction of work well done. A small group of kids from town had started coming by after school, fascinated by both the bikes and the farming. John watched as former gang members taught them about respect, responsibility, and the value of hard work, lessons they had learned themselves not so long ago. Sometimes, John told his veteran friends during their coffee meetings, the best victories are the ones that bring people together instead of pushing them apart. He looked out over his thriving fields, at the rebuilt fences and flourishing crops, and saw more than just a farm. He saw proof that everyone deserves a chance to change, to find their purpose, to belong to something bigger than themselves. The farm that had once been a target had become a symbol of transformation, proving that sometimes the strongest armor isn't made of steel, but of understanding, patience, and the willingness to see the potential in others.